Go on, be careful. All right. Well, we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 60, and this is going to be the concluding sermon of our series on the book of Isaiah. Okay, so it wasn't an exhaustive series by any stretch, but I hope that it was helpful and enlightening to you. It was definitely that for me, and just looking at some of the main themes and some of the key passages in the book of Isaiah. Starting next week, we're going to be starting a new series on the book of Galatians. Okay, which is going to be great. I'm excited for that. And so that's going to be starting up then next week, and we're going to take, we're going to deal with that book much more like we dealt with, say, Paul's letter to the Ephesians, which is much more verse by verse, and we're going to slow down. It's a much shorter book of the Bible compared to a massive book like the book of Isaiah. So that'll give us more time, and there's so much packed into those words and the phrases there. So we're going to take our time with the book of Galatians, and we'll be in that probably for several months. But looking forward to that. That'll be good. And that's going to be starting next week. This time of year it's actually, and this is having to do with the amount of sunlight that we get, it's some of the shortest days. So the more limited amount of light that we actually get and then we actually see. And it was because of that time that the early church, and when I say early, maybe not super early, this started in like the 4th century or so. The church started, especially more, I would say more liturgical churches, had a section in a series in a time of the year where they would celebrate Jesus as the light of the world, the light coming into the world, into the darkness. And it was called Epiphany, and it took place during this time of year. And some liturgical churches still honor that today, but I thought that was, or this season, but I thought that was interesting, in this time when we're limited, and we Ohioans, we have to be very jealous of our sunlight, because when we do get it, we don't get a whole lot of it. Actually, I had heard this, I don't know if this is true or not, there's in Ravenna, Ohio, there is the Ravenna Arsenal, which is a military base up there, kind of a base. And one of the decisions that led to them choosing that location many years ago was that it got most cloud cover of any of the potential areas in which they were looking. That's kind of depressing. Like, that's why it was selected, because that gave more cover from surveillance and so forth, you know. Now that kind of doesn't mean much anymore, because there's all this technology that can look through the clouds and all that stuff. But back when they made that decision, that was a deciding factor, and that's super depressing for us Northeastern Ohioans. But the good news is Jesus is our light, and that's what we acknowledge and recognize. And here in this passage, we'll start off here in the opening verses, where God is depicted, and it doesn't say this specifically, but as we look at these verses, God is depicted as the rising sun, as the sun. It says here, the first couple verses, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness will cover the earth, and deep darkness the peoples, but the Lord will rise upon you, and his glory will appear upon you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. Lift up your eyes round about and see. They all gather together, they come to you." And that's interesting that Isaiah, and of course through the inspiration of God, would use this picture of the rising sun. And if we recall, some of the things that was happening at this time was, because of Israel's disobedience, God had allowed the Babylonians and the Assyrians to come in and to to crush them and to destroy their city and to destroy the temple and carry many of them off into exile. And if we remember, one of the pressing questions that the Israelites had at this time was, is God finished with us? Is he done? Right? Is he done with us? And that prospect that he might be finished with using us as a people was far more devastating than even losing the physical temple. They were looking at, what does this mean? What does this mean? Have we messed up so badly that God is through with us? And that was the question. And there's several passages where Isaiah, even though declaring that yes, there is darkness, and yes, you're responsible for this, and God has permitted it, however, it leaves them with an overwhelming sense of hope. Not just that all these exiles that were carried off, that many of them will return, but even more than that. Because this hope that he is sharing is far greater than just a return from exile. And yes, that was a glorious time and a glorious thing that happened. But even then, when they came back, they had a lot of work to do. They had to rebuild the temple. They had to rebuild the city walls. And if you're interested in that venture, if you read through the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, it talks about that rebuilding, the time of rebuilding here. But this, we're going to look at this morning, how is it that God compares himself to light, and to specifically the imagery of the sun. And not only that, not only does he use that language, but if you notice, and we're going to talk about this too, there's a shift in these verses where not only is God that rising light, but then it says, nations will come to your light, and kings the brightness of your rising. Now that's interesting, because initially it's talking about God being this light, and then it shifts toward his people being that light because of him. And that's kind of incredible to think about, especially in a time when they were so just devastated by what was taking place and what was happening. But I'm going to ask the question here, how is it that God is like light? Or how is it that God is like the sun? And I'm going to talk about just a couple of aspects of that. The first one is that because of the sun, we can exist. Because of the sun, we can live. We can not only can we survive because there's enough temperature, right? But the sun does all kinds of stuff for us. And if it wasn't for that, we would immediately freeze. Everything not only would just freeze like Ohio winters, it would freeze like to the point where cells and atoms stop moving, right? Everything would just cease. And then beyond that, think about how the food we eat and everything is so dependent upon light, right? And we understand this now as the process of photosynthesis, where plants will convert light into food, right? It's really incredible. Back then, all they knew was there's some elements that need to be here, and light from the sun is one of them. So it gives us life. Another thing that the sun does, or light does, is it gives us truth. It gives us truth because it reveals. It reveals things that otherwise the darkness would hide. It lets things show forth. That's why you have headlights on your car. So you can see if there's a curve or if there's a deer standing there or something. It lets you see. It reveals truth. And then it also gives hope. It gives joy. They've done studies where, again, people this time of year, because of the lack of exposure and the lack of sunlight, people just get a little bit depressed, right? Seasonal affective disorder, I think it's called, where we just kind of, this like mild state of depression. And people that regularly struggle with depression, it gets kind of amplified during this dark time. It has to do with not having exposure to sunlight, and what else that leads to with the cold is kind of being trapped indoors more often. So things like that. But it gives us life, truth, and joy, hope. In the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul says about It's about Jesus, about God. It says, in him we live and move and have our being. That all of our existence is tied to him. And in a very real way, kind of like our physical existence is tied to the existence of the Son. The incredible thing is how with God, God is completely separate from us. He's completely independent from us. The word that would be used is transcendent. He is other. There's nowhere in this world where we could go and say, oh, here's a proof for God because here's a little bit of God that we see. It doesn't work like that. He is completely separate. To the point where there was a, this would have been probably in the 50s, perhaps 60s, when there was a Russian cosmonaut who went up into space and got to get outside of the Earth's atmosphere. And then when he came back, he famously reported, because he was an atheist, he famously reported, I went up into the heavens and I didn't see God. He says, I got up there, where God's supposed to be, and he's not there. And who do you think I'm going to quote as a rebuttal to this? Yes, good. Lewis. Lewis actually issued a statement to that, and he said, that would have been like Hamlet climbing up into the attic of the castle trying to find Shakespeare. Now think about that. He's a character in the story, and he's trying to find the author. It doesn't work like that, right? There's nowhere you can go and say, oh, here, I found God. Here he is. Here he is. He's up in the heavens. No, he is far beyond that. And just like Shakespeare authored Hamlet, and you could even make the case saying, because he was the author of Hamlet, he poured himself into all of it. But there's no place, there's no character in Hamlet that you could say, oh, this is God. He's not in it that way. He's in it and involved in a different way. There is saying, this is actually from, ironically, the statement from Columbia University. This is their, I don't want to say their tagline that they still use with it. Columbia University, and it is this: it's in your light we see light. And that's a quote from Psalms. That's a quote from Psalm 36, verse 9. In your light we see light. And they got that right early on, but I think if you were to attend there, how much light are you going to find? Probably not so much anymore, unfortunately. Unfortunately. When we consider the sun as it is, again, this will be the last time this morning, but another interesting quote here that I'm going to use from Lewis. He said this. He said, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Right? So we could go outside, and it looks like today through the windows that the sun is out. So we could go up and look up into the sky, and there's the sun. But how often do we do that? You really shouldn't do that too often. You shouldn't gaze at the sun very much, okay? If you do, we're going to have to give you a cane so you can find your way around, one of the red and white ones. You can't do that. But what does the sun do? We know the sun has risen not because we can stare at it, but because by it we can see everything else. By it we can see everything else. And it's much that way with Christianity. St. Augustine made this connection and this observation, and this is from the very opening of his work, the Confessions. At the very beginning, he said that our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. That there is something about the way God has created us, that there is this void that we try to fill with other things, but it really can only be filled by God himself. It only works that way. We have to have this connection with him and this light from him. I'm going to read, you can keep your finger in the book of Isaiah. I'm going to read from Ephesians. And this is Paul using the same kind of imagery and the same kind of wording to depict not only is God and not only is Jesus light, but the way in which that light, just like in Isaiah, the way in which the light has come, and then now we get to be a part of that. We get to be made into light because he is light, and we get to carry his light forward. This is from Ephesians chapter 5. I'm going to start in verse 6. It says, "Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience. Therefore, do not be partakers with them. For you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth, trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. Do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. But all things become visible when they are exposed to the light. For everything that becomes visible is light. For this reason we say, awake, sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." That's an incredible passage. That's incredible. And one of the things that stands out here, notice that it says, it doesn't say you were formerly in darkness. It says you were darkness. You were formerly darkness. So our issue is not just our circumstances. Our problem is not just we are in darkness, that we are sort of a helpless victim in this. No, we're actually participating in darkness. We are, by nature, naturally opposite of what light is, opposite of everything that God is. And then it says this, but now, you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. This is magnificent. I just have to mention this. This is where Christianity is completely different than any other religion or any other philosophy of life. Notice this order. It says, you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. The walk follows the reality. Does that make sense? The walk follows the reality. Paul is not saying, pretend to be like this or earn this status so that maybe God will smile on you. That's not what it is. He's not saying you need to earn this. He's saying this is now who you are. Walk as such. Walk the way you are now. And learn, right? Learn and grow who you are. Now that's incredible. And that might seem like a small distinction, but if Paul were to say, you need to behave this way, you need to do these things and not do those things, and then God will make you his children. That isn't it. That's not how we are changed. That's not how we become Christians, and that's not the process of living as a Christian. We're not doing it to earn anything. We're not doing it to earn anything. We have everything, and it's been granted to us because of Jesus. Now, another thing from this passage, it says, do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. But all things become visible when they are exposed to the light. For everything that becomes visible is light. So, with this analogy, now again, back then, they didn't have electricity. They couldn't walk into a room and flip a light switch and all of a sudden it's light and you can see. That's not how it worked. Back then, if you needed light, your choice was maybe a small candle or a lamp. which put off enough light, but not enough that you are going to be able to see like we can see in the dark. The single greatest invention that curbed crime immediately when it was implemented was the traffic light, the street light. Street light. Why? Because now all of a sudden, in the dark, you can't just behave and no one will see you. Right now, all of a sudden, that there's this potential that what you do is exposed, that what you do is evident and seen by others, that it's out there. Your deeds, you can't behave in this darkness anymore because now it's brought to light. And the hope here is that eventually everything will be exposed and everything will be brought into the light. If we are regenerate, that means that if we are Christians, if we have become believers in Jesus Christ, then those three aspects of God being light, that he has life, that he loves the truth, and that he is joyful, or that there is joy, that there is hope, those things become true of us. They become true of us, and we ought to expect that. Now, I'm going to use two individuals as an example here. Both of these are kind of giants in the Christian faith, okay, modern giants. John Wesley and Martin Luther. John Wesley and Martin Luther were giants, right? And we attribute so much to their life and to their works. But there's something that they had in common, and that was that they were both busy serving in vocational ministry before they became Christians. Did you know that? That they were both busy serving full-time in ministry before they got saved. Now think about that. And I'm going to share that as a warning, because whenever we think, oh, well, of course I'm a child of God. Of course I'm a Christian, right? I go to church on Sunday, right? I've said this before. I'm going to say this again. Being in church doesn't make you a Christian any more than standing in your garage makes you a car. Okay? You go and stand in your garage doesn't make you a car, right? And with Martin Luther especially, he was translating from the Greek into Latin. He was translating the book of Romans. So he had enough training and education to do that. And he was serving in a monastery, and he was teaching, and it was at that moment that he actually became a Christian. He realized that up until that point, it was just a religion for him. He was just going through the motions. And with Luther, he was very, very sensitive to his own failures and his own shortcomings. He was very sensitive to his own sin. So much so that he would spend 3 and 4 hours a day in confession. And it was things like this. You know, when we were all eating, all the monks, we were eating lunch, and I finished my plate, and I was still kind of hungry, and I looked over, and my brother beside me had a roll left, and I coveted his roll, and that is sin. I mean, that was him. That was Luther. He was so in tune with his own failings and guilt and sinfulness that he would spend 3 and 4 hours in confessing. And it's like, good grief, how much trouble can you get in a monastery, right? How much do you have to confess? To the point where the one who would take his confession oftentimes tried to put him on some other task to keep him busy because he was tying up a lot of his time, right? And then when Luther, and this was from the Book of Romans, when he was rendering this and he realized that salvation and that righteousness was a gift from God. When that dawned on him, he described this, and he said it was like someone rolled back the heavens and he could see for the first time the glory of God. It was for the very first time for him, he understood that wow, my salvation, I don't have to earn it. Right? And if I miss a sin in confession, now in his Roman Catholic tradition, if you did that, then that's a problem. That sin's still on you. But once he came to the realization that all of his sin had been dealt with in the cross, and that righteousness, the very righteousness of God himself, of Jesus Christ, was gifted to him. It was his. And that was now who he was. It was only then that he became a Christian, that he realized. And then we know kind of the rest of history, his impact in the Reformation. It's incredible. But just think that both he and Wesley served and worked and taught people and were intelligent, but hadn't experienced salvation yet, personally. And that's incredible. And that is indeed a warning for us. Now, if you've been a Christian for a while, there are some things that you would expect to see. Okay, and this is within your own life. And I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions. One of them is, are you more filled with joy than you were a couple of years ago? Are you more filled with joy than you were a couple of years ago? And you might say, well, these past few years have been especially trying. Yes, I know. That's how God teaches us to be joyful. It's oftentimes when circumstances get changed. And so sometimes we think, oh, yes, I have joy, but we find that our joy might be centered in our circumstances. And so when that is removed, when that's taken away, and when that's changed, and we realize that maybe we're not as content as we had hoped. Are you more filled with joy? Are you more humble? Are you more humble than you were? And a good way to see this is, how well do you take criticism? How well do you take criticism? If someone comes up and says something to you that is a critique, so often, I know for me, my initial like pushback to that is, you get defensive and you think of all kinds of reasons and justification. But what our response should be initially is, maybe they're right. And then what do you do with that? You can't just all of a sudden believe everyone that tells you that you're doing something wrong. So ask people who know you, right? Ask people who care about you. Am I like this? Do I do this? And if they say, well, then, okay, maybe that needs dealt with. But it takes a level of security to be able to accept criticism. It takes a level of security there. And how well you give criticism. Okay, that's important too. Right? And there's right ways and wrong ways to do that. Is it really done in love? Or is it done in a condescending fashion? Are you wiser? Are you wiser than you were a few years ago? Well, that doesn't mean you know more stuff. Right? Wisdom is the ability to apply. It's the ability to use what you know and to put it into practice. And this kind of growth, normal, natural Christian growth it's from the in. It's from the inside out. It's not something that you can just change and polish up on the outside, but it's from within. In the book of Matthew, I'm going to read a couple verses here. This is Matthew chapter 5. And this is Jesus speaking. And he says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot of men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." Here's the reality. In whatever relationships, social circles, family, job, whatever you find yourself in, you may be the closest thing to Jesus Christ that somebody else ever sees. Now, that's a pretty humbling thing to think about. You may be the closest thing to Jesus Christ that somebody else ever sees. And if we think about that, when I think about that, I'm thinking, gosh, I need to get out of the way. I need to get Josh out of the way so that Jesus can be who he needs to be. Right? I can't be and do whatever this person needs. Jesus can. Jesus can. And we're to walk in his light, not to just, not to be like little miserable replicas of him in a way that is broken and failing, but getting out of the way and letting him be who he is in us. And there were a handful of ways that the early Christians stood out, that they were seen as being countercultural, that when people looked at them, there was something very odd about these Christians. And I'm just going to list a few of the ways here. One of them was their integrity. Okay, Christians were different. They did their best to keep their word. They behaved and they did things that was right and good, even when no one they thought was looking. They were generous. Christians were generous. They were sympathetic. Right? They sympathized with people. They were hospitable. Right? They welcomed people in. Chastity was another one. I mentioned this in Sunday school, but early on in the Roman Empire, the idea that you only sleep with your wife was something that was just kind of crazy. That was a crazy thought for them. And these Christians, like they viewed sexuality as only belonging to the covenant bounds of marriage. And that was crazy. That was countercultural. And they were patient in suffering. They were patient. They endured suffering. They endured it in such a way that was just unreal. And one of the things, I shared this in Sunday school class this morning, but one of the things that the Christians did back in the first couple centuries, Romans, if they had children, if they gave birth to a baby and they didn't want the child, or they, for whatever reason, couldn't raise it or something, they would take it down and throw it in the river. That's just what they would do. And Christians started getting into boats and getting these babies out of the river. And then when they would rescue one, they would say, okay, whose turn is it? And they would literally go to those and fellow believers, and they would say, okay, it's your turn, you get a new child. And they would raise them and love them and teach them just like they were their own. It was just unheard of. It was unheard of. They weren't there up on the bridge yelling at how bad the people throwing them in were. They would just go down and save them. Go down and save them and raise them, love them. That's incredible. Incredible. Something else that I mentioned here that light does. Light reveals truth, right? It exposes. It reveals what is actually there. If you've ever been to like a really fancy date night restaurant place, what do you notice about the lighting? It's dim. Why is that? Because people are more attractive in the dark. That's why. People are more attractive in the dark. So these restaurants that are designed just for, especially for date night, it's always real dim, so that you can go there and you can sit across from, the person that you love and you can say, oh, you're so beautiful. And they can say, I'm over here. And you say, oh, you're so beautiful. Yeah. But it hides, it hides the imperfections, right? Light exposes. Light brings those things and exposes them for what they really are. And, whenever Adam and Eve sinned, what they realized was that they were naked, which is very strange because, they had been naked, but they didn't realize it. In other words, they had this feeling that they were now exposed, and they had to go and hide. So they fled from the presence of God, and then they made themselves coverings. They hid. And this is, by the way, why we wear clothes. Okay? But think about this. This idea now that has plagued humanity forever is that if I am to be loved, then I need to conceal certain things about myself. I can either be known fully or loved, but I'm probably never going to get both. So I need to pick one. And the greatest thing that came along, I'm talking sort of tongue-in-cheek for this, is like social media. Because of social media, you get to control the image that you put out there, right? And if there's something that's deeply embarrassing for you, you're probably not going to put that up, right? You're gonna kind of control that. But so we in Adam and Eve, I think this has kind of been ingrained in us. It's that if we want to be loved, we're only going to be loved to the extent that we can hide things about ourselves that are not perfect or good. But deep down, we have a desire to what? To be loved and known. We have a desire to be loved and known. In John chapter 8, if you would, turn to John 8. Jesus makes a pretty radical claim here. And it's radical because of the broader context of what he was saying and when he was saying it. But in John 8, in verse 12, then Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. I am the light of the world. Okay, now we probably heard that, that Jesus has said that. But if you step back and look at the bigger context, this is in John 8. In John 7 was the observance of a certain Jewish feast. And that feast was, you might say in your Bibles, the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles. It was the same feast. Okay. Now this feast, again, this is something that we're kind of removed from, so we don't really feel the weight of what Jesus was actually saying here. But what he was claiming, I think, was nothing short of claiming to be divine, claiming to be God himself. And the reason for that is, and I'm going to share just briefly about what the Feast of Tabernacles or what the Feast of Booths was. It was like a big Jewish campout. Okay, where everyone would come. It was one of the feasts where you had to travel, you get together, and then you construct a pretty rickety booth or tabernacle. Tabernacle just means dwelling, but it was kind of like a tent, kind of like a little very primitive structure, and that you would live in that for a period of several days. And the reason that they would do that and that they would go through that process was to remember the time when their ancestors were in the wilderness traveling around and they didn't have a permanent dwelling. So whatever dwelling, whatever structure, whatever cover that they had to be able to throw up, stay in, and then tear it down and move it. And along with that was the tabernacle itself, which was also a temporary structure for God. It was much more elaborate, but even at that, it was actually kind of a magnificent structure, but it was temporary, and toward the end of those 40 years, it got pretty tattered. It got pretty used and pretty worn. But it was a picture of how God was with them in the wilderness, that they would dwell in these booths, these tents, and that they would remember that God was with them as they were moving around in the wilderness as he was leading them into the promised land. And for Jesus here on the heels of this to stand up and say, I'm the light of the world. What he was claiming was, well, here. When they were in the wilderness, what was leading them around? Yes, it was a pillar of fire at night, and it was a pillar of cloud during the day. That went before them, it went ahead of them, and wherever it went, they followed. Now, let's think about this. Out in the wilderness, in the middle of the day, it's going to be very, very hot. And so this pillar of cloud did what? It shaded them. It brought them shade. It shielded them from the destructive sunlight. Think about that. Think of how it would have drawn them into the shadow of this of God, right? Of the presence of God leading them around. And that was during the day. At night, if you know anything about the wilderness, as soon as the sun goes down, what happens? It starts to get cold because the atmospheric density is much less there. So the heat just is gone. So at night, what was God to them? A pillar of fire. Light, heat. Again, this concept of he is with them. In one sense, he is providing light when they need it, and with that he is providing heat. And during the day, when the light of the sun would destroy them, he is shielding them. That's incredible. That is truly incredible. Because, as we know, and we know this with fire, at least we should learn this like pretty early on. If you ever go camping, right, you need to be a certain distance. Okay? Actually, I went, let's see here. This was in November. I tried to get out and do a few days of backpacking with some buddies, and we got out a little later this year than we normally do, but it was in November. And it got pretty cold. Pretty cold. Here, embarrassing story, okay? So we had to cross at one point this creek. It was pretty big. It was wider than the width of this room. And that water was cold. Okay, it was pretty cold. We had to cross it. Well, and sometimes there's good places to cross, and sometimes there's not. You know, so the place where we crossed, where there's some rocks kind of sticking up, and you try to find your best footing going across there. And some rocks are sturdy and will take you stepping on them, and some of them won't. And so I found one that didn't, and I ended up in the drink just about like to here, and it was cold. So when you're going to do that, you put everything on your person up high in your pack because you think, I'm probably going to get wet. So at least if I get wet, then it's not going to be all of me, hopefully. So then I crossed, kind of fell into the water. Like, didn't just kind of, I actually fell into the water. And then had to walk. You know, by that time, I'm just like, oh, well, I'm wet. So here we go. And I'm walking through the water and then up the other side. And then after that, we were going to make camp at the top of, it was Breathe Mountain. So from that creek is, I don't know how long, it seemed longer than it was. But the good news was I couldn't feel my legs. So it wasn't as painful sometimes as it is, but it's hard to walk when you can't feel your legs. So we had to hike up there, and then we made camp, and then I got to start a fire and dry out my boots and my socks and everything, so that was good. But what I will say, when you dry your boots out, you put them on sticks over the fire, but you don't put them too close, because if you do, you won't have any boots. And so you get them as close as you can. But with fire is a great thing because it'll heat you, but it will also destroy. It'll destroy, right? If you're unguarded from it, or if you're too close, the same thing that will bring you life and heat will also take it from you pretty quickly. And in Scripture, there are places where God refers to himself as fire, as a consuming fire. Now that's interesting. That is something that is kind of terrifying, and it should be. The story of, and I always get these names confused. I think it was Elijah was the first one, right? And he gets carried off into the chariot of fire. I want you to think about the imagery with that, because we haven't sang this song in a while, but you know the song, Sweet Chariot, Coming to Take Me Home, you know. Chariots back then were not sweet. They were machines of war. And oftentimes they were made of iron, and whenever they were deployed, they were so heavy that they usually killed the horses that pulled them, because they were just like kind of tanks back then, except they were powered by horses. But imagine this machine of war that's made of fire somehow. That's what is your Uber out of here. That's your ride home. That's kind of terrifying. Think about that. We think, oh, this is like this lovely thing. It's like, you know, that shows up, and it's like your Uber has arrived, and you're like, that? I'm going to get on that, and it's going to take me to the presence of God. The incredible thing is, and I'm going to wrap up with this, because of what Jesus Christ has done, and because of him, in a very real sense, enduring hellfire for us, enduring the punishment of hell for us, and what that is, the wrath of God for us, then there is nothing about the nature of God that has to terrify us. We can look at the justice of God, which before the cross, like on the other side of being a Christian, that should terrify you. But now, being a believer and knowing that Jesus has satisfied every demand of the law that is put on us on our behalf, we can look at the justice and the wrath of God and breathe a sigh of relief and actually glory in who he is. Glory in who he is. Not be driven by fear, but this is God. This is God. And we can look at the justice of God and think, yes, this is a good thing. This is a good thing. Not because I'm perfect, right? Far from it, but because the demands of the law have been satisfied for me on my behalf. So that we can come to the light not fearing exposure. Think about that. You know, early on in Paul's ministry, he called himself the least of the saints. Toward the end of his ministry, he called himself the chief of sinners. He was okay with God exposing his failures. He was okay with that. He was okay because he knew that he wasn't accepted based on his performance. And so all of his shortcomings, all of his failures was just another way to glorify God and say, you know what? Yes, this is who I used to be. This ain't who I am anymore. I am a child of the light because of him. And that's incredible. That's incredible. And it takes a level of security in that kind of relationship to let God critique you and to let him kind of peel back the layers and say, okay, this is a problem. This is a flaw. This is of darkness, and this is not of me. And we can approach him. We can enter into that light, and it's okay. Because that same light and exposure that would terrify us before, now it's like, I need this. I need you to change me because there's something wrong with me right now. I need you to change me, and I need to walk as children of light because that is what you have made me. And that's incredible. And that's, you could say in a nutshell, that's the message of the gospel. And what's so incredible about that is the gospel will humble you to the ground, but it will affirm you to the skies, both together. It's humbling because what I have done, the sins that I've committed, required the death of God. That's humbling, that this is not just something small. But the affirming part is that he paid it. He paid it. He chose to take that. And that's incredible. That is incredible. So let me go ahead this morning and close us in prayer. Dear good and gracious God, we are so thankful for everything about you. We're thankful that you are merciful and gracious and long-suffering, but we are thankful that you are just and righteous and holy and perfect as well. And we are in a place because of Jesus Christ, because of your Son, we don't have to put any one of your attributes above another, but that you are who you are. And we glory in that. You are a consuming fire. And we trust you, we love you, and we know that you care deeply for us, so much so that you have made a way that we can be in a relationship with you, that we can dwell with you, and that your presence and your perfection doesn't destroy us. As a matter of fact, it turns us into beings more like yourself. That's incredible. And I thank you so much for that. And these things I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
GCN to join us for hymn number